Okay, in this chapter we're looking at social psychology. Now, social psychology is a separate dimension of psychology from the general umbrella of psychology. And so social psychology, it has a greater focus on how do we form our impressions both of ourselves and others, and how do we judge people, and looks at that role of everybody else in our lives and how it impacts and influences the decisions that we make. And so when we look at we're going to look in this particular part of this segment I've done here. We're going to look at and how do we explain our behavior and how do we explain other behaviors. So when I do something good, do I take responsibility for it, or do I just say, well, it was because of the good luck? Or if I look at you and something that you've done, do I blame you, or do I have some awareness that there might be other experiences or other circumstances in the world that could have influenced you? We're also going to look at what influences what we find is attractive. People that we look for long-term mates, people we want to connect with in terms of friendship. What influences who and what we find is attractive. We're also going to look at some very basic and important elements of social psychology, in particular how it influences some of the initial work that was emerging during the early stages of social psychology. We're going to look at conformity, and we're going to look at obedience. And we're going to consider and look at compliance. And lastly, we're going to look at the influence of the group and how the influence of the group can make me maybe act in different ways, let alone think in different ways. And I will be posting in the week 7 some additional videos for you to watch. It'll be videos of Solomon Asch's experiment on conformity. It's a critical one that has a big influence on the direction of conformity research. We'll also look at obedience research, and the one that had the huge impact on that, you may have heard of Milgram's experiment. I'll show you a video on that as well. And then lastly, around the influence of the group and looking at the social roles element, we'll look at Zimbardo's prison experiment, and I've got a video that I'll show, I'll post of that as well. Alright, so I encourage you to view the videos, get a little insight into social psychology. It's very interesting to see how the group can influence how we think and feel.
Okay, we're looking at social psychology, and we'll first get a little bit of a definition, which is basically is 3 main areas of interest in this topic, and it explains how the actual or imagined or even applied presence of other influence in our thoughts, feelings, behaviors. Now when it says the actual, so it means actual influences of other people in our thoughts and feelings and behaviors. It also looks at imagined. That means that sometimes if I'm in a store with my friends and I might reach out to try to steal something, my mom won't be there, but my mom might be in my thoughts. So the implied presence of her might influence my behavior or my thoughts or my feelings, or implied presence. So social psychologists are interested in how variables within an individual contribute to the response to social influences. These group influences or group variables are how people that you don't know and those that are associated with you can influence your behavior, and that interactions among individuals and group variables shape our behavior. And so they want to look at all of those sorts of elements, and in particular, or in addition, they want to sort of view some components about our social perception. Now, social perception is the process that we use to obtain critically important information about other people. And one of the main components of social perception is what's called the primacy effect. And this is the tendency of the overall impression to be influenced by more than the first impression that's received by the information that comes later. So the primacy is just to say first impressions make a huge impact. The second pieces of information that come later, although they may influence our impression, it's the first effects, the primary effects, the first effects. Information that is consistent with the first impression is often accepted, even though it comes very quickly to us, microseconds even. It strengthens the impression. Inconsistent information is usually disregarded. So if my first impression of you is not very positive and subsequent information about you is improved and is good, I'm probably still going to hold on to the first impression. When you're asked to name the qualities, list your positive qualities first. So when you're making a first impression, or trying to list your first qualities first, your best qualities, because that's probably going to help them with their first impression. A firm handshake makes a powerful first impression. Conveys that the person is confident and outgoing. Mood affects impressions. When we're happy, our impressions of others are usually more positive. Now, sometimes when we are with people, we make some decisions about whether or not we think, they're just bad people, or the circumstance they found themselves in allowed them to behave in the way they did that we would label negative. And these are called attributions. This is the assignment of the cause or of a cause to explain either somebody else's behavior or our own behavior. And there's two kinds essentially. There's such situational attribution and dispositional attribution. Situational attribution is where we attribute a behavior to some external cause or factor. After you failed an exam, you say, well, the test was unfair. It wasn't my fault that I failed. It was the test was unfair. So it's the situation, not directly to me. Whereas dispositional attribution is attributing the behavior to some internal cause. You. The personal trait, a personal motive, or a personal attitude. After failing an exam, you say, I'm no good at school. This is demonstrating a lack of ability or something within you. So either we look at a circumstances out there to explain somebody else's behavior or to explain our behavior, that's situational. Or dispositional, where we attribute some internal reason for our inadequacies or our strengths, or somebody else's inadequacies or their strengths. Now, as much as that might be, the two basic ones, we can break this down a wee bit further. And we look at attribution, we can see there's actor-observer effect. And really what's happening here is the tendency to attribute one's own shortcomings to situational factors and the behaviors of others primarily to dispositional. So us being the actor, we look upon ourselves in a more positive way, and we look to explain similar behavior of others in more negative ways. Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, each one attributes the violence to the other group. The Irish blame the Protestants. The Catholics blame the Protestants, and the Protestants blame the Catholics. They're all murderers and evil. Each justifies their own violence with situational causes, that we have to protect ourselves from those evil ones. And so that's the actor-observer effect. When we consider what a fundamental attribution error is, this is the tendency to attribute others' behavior in a dispositional way. We look at what you do and why you do it as being reasons within you, not the situation. And so we call that a fundamental attribution error, like a basic rule or basic error that we make. And then we also have what we call, and social psychologists describe, as self-serving bias. This is a tendency to attribute one's success to the dispositional causes and one's failures to situational. This means that if we're successful, we take on the positives. We say, that's because I did really well. Where if we fail, we say, well, it's the circumstances that I was in. It was the situation. So athletes will attribute their success to skill and their failure to poor officiating. Now, when we look at this sort of looking at others and looking at the relationship between others, we often look at the role of attraction. That is to say, what influences attraction? And there's two things that we could look at. One would be proximity. That proximity, whether that be physical or geographic closeness, makes it easier to be friends and with people who are close at hand. So people that you're in school with, you're more likely to have friendships with or romantic relationships with because you're close to them on a day-to-day basis and get to see them more frequently. Whereas people that you don't see as frequently or are not in close proximity, we're less likely to become friends with. And then the second piece of this influences to attraction is what's called mere exposure effect. And this is the tendency to feel more positively towards the stimulus as a result of repeated exposure to it. You see it more frequently, you're more likely to like it or have at least awareness about it. Advertisers rely on it to influence people based on, influence them about food, songs, clothing, styles. The more that you see it, the more that you'll be influenced by it. We tend to pick friends from the same age, gender, race, and socioeconomic classes. based on the frequency by which we see them more frequently. And we tend to choose friends and lovers with similar views on things that's most important to us. Again, about mere exposure effect. And similar interests and attitudes towards leisure activities make leisure activity time and time spent with each other more rewarding. Now, there are some one other, at least primary condition, if you will, around influencing factors on attraction, and that is physical attraction. Now, what's meant by this more predominantly is that people of all ages have strong tendency to prefer physically attractive people. 6-month-old infants spend more time looking at a photo of attractive people. But there's an explanation for physical attraction. It's not maybe what you think. For example, symmetrical faces and symmetrical bodies are viewed by most people as more attractive and more sexually appealing. That 0.93% correlation, which just means 93% correlation among Asian, Hispanic, and African Americans and white females on attractive ratings. That is to say that faces that are more balanced, meaning symmetrical, or bodies that are more balanced or symmetrical are viewed as being more correlated with attractiveness. Now, in addition to this particular trait is what's called a halo effect, and this is the tendency to assume that a person has generally positive or generally negative traits after observing one major positive or negative trait. And I used the examples in the slide there, that George Clooney is, you may have seen him in a movie, and because he did something once that you viewed as positive, you put a halo effect on him by viewing him in a way that's very positive. And Steve Jobs, because of his influence in technology, you may view him with a halo effect because of his major impact on your life with the use of phones or Apple products. You may feel that he is seen as in a more positive light. Now, attraction certainly has an influence in terms of friends or attitudes or beliefs that we have about people and circumstances, but it also influences romantic attraction and mating. And so there is what's called a matching hypothesis. People tend to have lovers and spouses, who are similar to themselves in physical attractiveness and other assets. Mismatched couples are more likely to end the relationship, and fear of rejection keeps many from pursuing mismatched attractiveness. Similarities that have the most influence are personality similarities, physical traits, intelligence, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and attitudes. All of these play a role in matching hypothesis. It's just not and solely physical attraction. Now, social psychology has been interested in things like what makes up who we are and how our relationships are formed. But part of what's been very instrumental in social psychology and the study in social psychology has been a number of key conditions or factors. And here's one that's been started very early in social psychology, and it's conformity. And by definition, any change or adopting of behavior or attitude that you've had in an effort to be consistent with what would be understood to be social norms of a particular group or the expectations of other groups, this would be considered conformity. And in order to understand conformity, one needs to understand social norms. And social norms, these are attitudes or standards, if you will, of what behavior is expected of members of a particular group. And so there are social norms in our society, that you drive on the right-hand side of the street. Now, that's not the social norm in every society. You go to England or you go to Jamaica, you'll be driving on the other side of the street. But because everyone conforms to those social norms, it makes it more comfortable and predictable as to how to navigate the world. Now, there's other forms of conformity, of course, conforming in terms of dress. Some conformity is necessary for society to function, like I said, with the roads. Teens who attend schools where a majority of students don't drink or smoke are less likely to use substances themselves. They'd be conforming to different standards or social norms, conforming to others' expectations to have their esteem, approval, friendship, love, or company. So we conform for different reasons. But Solomon Ash wanted to find out more about what makes people conform. And so he developed some strategies, and he had the tendency in his study, and I've posted a video in week 7 on Solomon Rosh's study on conformity. And the tendency is to go along with the majority, not altered by the number of confederates. And what he meant by that was, it didn't matter how many people there. If there were 3 people there and 2 of them agreed with something that you thought was not correct, then you would eventually start to conform. If one person voices a dissent, conformity is not very strong. That is to say, what happens if, say, you have 5 or 6 people in the experiment, and all 5 are saying the wrong answer, you are more likely to go along with it. But if one out of those people agrees with you, then your conformity starts to drop significantly. And you'll see better when you watch the video on conformity. Now, groupthink is where members of a group, whether that, most often it's a tightly knit group, it's a group that's working on something together, or it's a group of friends, are more concerned with preserving group solidarity and group uniformity. That is, they're more tendency to be agreeable than with objectively evaluating the alternatives in decision making. And now I've put the Challenger images at the bottom, the astronauts and the accident that occurred, as a primary example of groupthink. It's considered a prime example of it, in that the people who were responsible for the setting the stage for the takeoff of the Challenger were a tight-knit group who were concerned, unfortunately, with group solidarity and uniformity, that even though some people disagreed with the launch time, that it weren't ready, there was something that they needed to check and correct, they went along with the group, they conformed, and unfortunately the result was the explosion of the Challenger space program. Now, in addition to conformity, social psychologists have been interested with other things that perplex researchers. And the next one was what was called obedience. For most people in society, we must obey rules and respect authority if society is to survive. Unquestioned obedience can cause unbelievable, horrific acts. And in this instance, Stanley Milgram looked at the Nazi Germany experience. This is back in those years during the Second World War, and his order to exterminate Jews. And he devised an experiment, and you see a graphic in the right hand side of the slide about what that would look like. Now again, I've posted a video of his experiment, and you'll see his machine that's posted there and there on the top left hand side, where essentially the experimentees, the people who were involved, would actually give people 450 volts shock for getting a wrong question. 60% of the participants delivered maximum voltage despite the pleading of the learner. No one checked on the victim without asking permission. Additional studies confirm Milgram's findings, and these have continued right on through to modern times. Now, mind you, they're done differently because it was questioned the ethicalness of some of his strategies, given back in the 50s. Ethics was a different kettle of fish than it is today. Confederate refusal study, the presence of other persons who refused to go along, gave the courage for many to defy authority. So if this experiment were repeated and had people involved who would say, no, I'm not doing it anymore, others would gain the courage to say no as well. Now we look at obedience in a softer way and trying to get compliance from people. That is to say, trying to get people to do as we want them to do. And compliance, acting in accordance with the wishes or suggestions or direct requests with other people. And there's some techniques that we use. There we go. The foot and door technique is a strategy designed to gain favorable response to a small request at first, with the intent of getting the person to agree to a larger request later. And that's why it's called the foot and door. I'm going to get my foot in the door, give you a small request, get you to comply, and then I'll start to introduce larger requests to get you to comply further, to follow along with a pattern, if you will. The door and face technique, this is where someone makes a large, very unreasonable expectation and then expects the person's going to refuse that one, and then the person will be more likely to agree to the smaller request later. And then the lowball technique, someone makes a very attractive initial offer to get the person committed to the action and then makes terms less favorable after that comment, or after that commitment, I mean. But it did start to influence or direct us towards, and this is something that social psychologists started to study a lot more, is what is it about the group influence? What is it about what makes people comply, or at least what they would call later social influence, social facilitation. And this is where any positive or negative effect on our own performance that can be attributed to the presence of others. That is to say that if I'm performing and doing something by myself, that if I had an audience, that I could in fact perform better. And so that audience, or having other people present, could promote my experience. Now, this was originally integrated back in 1800s, 1890 I think it was, when Stanley Tippett, I believe, was the researcher who was noticing that cyclists, professional cyclists, would perform better in groups than they did by themselves. And he observed and wondered why that was. And it has later been further researched to be called what we now know as social facilitation. Now, the effect of audience, this is the impact of passive spectators on a performance. Does it make a difference? And arguably, in research, it does. Now, co-action effects. This is the impact on performance caused by the presence of other people engaged in the same task, rather than someone just watching you, which has its own effects. Co-action effects just means you are working with other people in the same task, and that by doing it together you work better. And that's why the cyclist image is at the bottom, that you tend to cycle better in a group than you do individually. There's a lot of things that you will tend to do better in a group than you will individually. So when we look at this, we see presence of others, the audience effect and coaction. The arousal is heightened and the dominant response is enhanced. So you either have performance is enhanced or performance suffered. Some people where that performance will suffer. Now, in that instance, it's called something else. It's called social loafing. The tendency to exert less effort when working with others than when working alone. It occurs in situations where a person's contribution to the group can be identified. Individuals are neither praised for good behavior nor blamed for poor. The workplace problems, of course, especially when there's unlimited internet access, as people can get easily distracted. Achievement motivation levels may facilitate social loafing, that is to say, low achievement motivation. Individuals will contribute little when paired with hard workers. Did the opposite when paired with others who didn't work very hard. Now, it moved into, and we carried in this sort of group influence into other terms. Now, most notably, we looked at social roles. And here where, the socially defined roles of behavior considered appropriate for individuals occupying certain positions within a given group. This can shape our behavior quickly and dramatically, both positively and negatively. So based on what social roles we take, mom, dad, police officer, nurse, doctor, teacher, these social roles can influence our own behavior and the behavior of others. Now, the tendency has been, and this is going to lead to another major influence in social psychology, is what's called de-individualization. And this is the process in which individuals, you and I, we lose our sense of personal identity as a result of identifying with a larger group. And we see this a lot in mob mentality, as it's also known as, that if you are a part of a larger group that starts to act out negatively, there is a tendency to begin to join that acting out group, not because you're so supportive of it, but you lose your sense of individuality and gain a sense of anonymity. And this is what's called de-individualization. Now, in conjunction with the previous dialogues on conformity and on obedience, there was further looking at the roles, looking at social roles and how that can influence our behavior based on our perception of those social roles. And Philip Zimbardo did what was called the Stanford Prison Experiment in the 60s, and I will post a video as well in week 7 on this experiment. And here, what he demonstrated was that the negative effects of social roles. Participants role-played prisoners and guards so well that the study was ended within 6 days of its starting. Zimbardo simulated the prison environment by randomly assigning participants to the social roles of either prison guards or inmates, and the social roles influenced the prison's behaviors. And the prisoners began to acting like real prisoners and the guards like real guards. This experiment, although it was ended in 6 days, Zimbardo has gone on to continue the research in this and became an expert witness in the trial of the whistleblower in the Abu Ghraib prison experience, where prisoners were treated in horrific manners by U.S. military. He became an expert witness to describe the influence of social roles on people's behaviors and attitudes. All right, this is the end of part 1, and we'll have part 2 posted for you as well. All right then, have a good day.